Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's up off the ground and the suspension is hanging. The next thing we're going to do is move along to removing all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Okay, now that we have the wheel off of there, we have a nice clear view of our caliper. This is part of the braking system. We're going to have to go ahead and get the caliper out of the way. Attached to the caliper, you have your flex hose, and attached to that, you have an ABS wire. The flex hose and the ABS wire are both very delicate. You don't want to damage them in any way, but we do want to separate them. I'm going to make my way right here and just separate the ABS wire from the flex hose. You can see the little clip that it slides into. Let's also remove this area from the bracket. Now we can remove both of our caliper bracket bolts. To remove these, we're going to use a 21mm socket. We'll leave that in there a couple threads. Fully remove both of those bolts. Now let's slide the caliper off of the brake rotor. Now once you have it off of there, just give it a quick inspection. Take a look at the pads. You want to make sure there's plenty of meat on them, and you also want to make sure you don't see any fluid making its way onto the pads. If you see fluid, it might be brake fluid, in which case you might have to replace the caliper. Assuming it looks good, let's go ahead and set this aside, making sure we're putting no pressure on our flex hose. Let's continue on removing the ABS wire from the bracket down along here. Now this should have a couple little push tabs that go into the bracket. Ours look like they were broken and somebody used some wire ties, so I'll just go ahead and cut these off of here and replace them when we go to reinstall this. As you're doing this, be very careful not to damage the ABS wire in any way. Now, if you were to follow this ABS wire, it comes up right behind the shock tower. Now, looking at the ABS wire connector, you're going to find a little red tab. That's a locking tab. Just go ahead and use a small pick or a small screwdriver, pull that down and away. And then you're going to squeeze on the little square tab that you can see that's very close to the red lock. Then you can separate the two. Now that we have that separated, give it a quick inspection. If you see any funny colors, it's probably corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. Carefully grab onto that ABS wire. We'll pull it down and out of here. Now let's look down along the area where the axle and the ball joint are. You can see that it's hooked into this bracket. Just go ahead and slide it right out of there as well. Now once you have it out of there, we'll just continue on by bringing it out, and then we'll just hang it aside, making sure that we're not going to damage it in any way. Grab onto that rotor, we'll give it a little wiggle and remove it from the vehicle. Give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Now let's move along to this area here. You're going to find a 14mm bolt head, and if you follow it in closer to the knuckle, you'll find a 14mm locking nut. We need to go ahead and remove this from the knuckle. So to do that, I'm going to make my way right over to the 14mm nut and turn this counterclockwise to remove it. You want to make sure that you don't change the adjustment on this though. The purpose of this is to make sure that you don't turn your wheel too far. When you turn your wheel all the way to the right, this is going to swing all the way over and hit up against the differential tube right here. If you make too much of an adjustment on this, you might not be able to steer far enough, or you might turn too far. Give that bolt a quick inspection, make sure it's still reusable. It's a good idea to clean down the threaded area. Move along to the axle nut. We're going to use a 36mm socket, turn this counterclockwise, and fully remove the nut. Typically, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace these anytime you remove them. But if you're not, give it a good inspection and make sure you use some red thread locker when you go to reinstall it. Continue on with a hammer and punch. We're going to come right in the center of the axle and break it free from the wheel bearing. Once you've got some movement, we can continue on. Now let's move along to the front of the knuckle. You're going to find that you have the areas where your tie rod ends connect onto. We're going to remove both of these 21mm nuts, and then of course remove the tie rod ends from the knuckle. We'll just start the nut on there a few good threads. Continue on with your hammer and punch. We're going to come right in the center of each of those studs and break these free. If you want to use some penetrant, it's probably a good idea. If the hammer and punch doesn't work, you could also continue on with a socket. Just give it a couple of loving bonks. Of course, you don't want to damage your tools in any way. Now let's have a look at the back side of the knuckle. You're going to find the 3 mounting bolts that hold the wheel bearing to the knuckle. To remove each of these, we're going to use a 12.13mm socket. Now to access the other two a little bit easier, I'm going to come from the back side. Let's go ahead and turn this the other direction, and we can remove the other two. All right, I've got that one nice and loose. I'm just going to take that and put it in a couple good threads. Now we can fully remove our third, and then we'll just go ahead and get the wheel bearing out of here. We'll just use a little bit of penetrant on this. Now to remove the bearing, sometimes you can just grab onto it, give it a little wiggle, and it should want to pull away from the knuckle. Other times, it might be stuck in there with rust or corrosion or something the like. If that's the case, just go ahead and take your bolts. You're going to start it in there. Make sure it's in there at least 5 good threads. It's very important to make sure you've got a couple good threads in there. The next thing you would want to do is carefully use your 12.13mm socket, put it right on there. And then just give it a couple loving bonks with your hammer until you see the wheel bearing start to break free. You could do the same to all the bolts. Once it seems as though it's free enough, remove all of them and then the bearing from the knuckle. As you start removing the bearing and the backing plate, make sure the ABS wire is coming with you and you do not damage it in any way. Let's set that aside. Okay, we're at the point that we can go ahead and take the axle right out of here. Now to do that, I'm just going to carefully grab onto this. I'm going to reach along inside this area and pull it out of the differential. If it doesn't seem like it wants to slide out, you can carefully use a pry bar up against the differential tube and the axle and gently separate it. Let's carefully pull this out of here. Now let's just go ahead and turn this knuckle a little bit, and we can start removing the cotter pins that hold the upper ball joint nut and the lower ball joint nut in place. It's always a good idea to replace these. Now we can start removing our mounting nuts. The lower ball joint nut is a 32 millimeter nut. Once you have that nut off of there, just give it a quick inspection. And then we're just going to start it back on here a couple threads. Remove that bracket, give it a quick inspection, and then go ahead and set it aside. Now we're at the point that we can start removing the knuckle from the differential. Now when we do this, of course we still have the lower ball joint nut on here. We'll consider that a safety nut. Now we'll continue on with a hammer. We're just going to give this a couple loving bonks just to try to break it free from the ball joints. Some people might try to use a pickle fork up along this area, but you could potentially damage the boots. Just keep that in mind. Now that that's broken free, we can remove our safety nut. Remove the knuckle from the vehicle. There it is, friends. All right, friends, now we can get ready to install our knuckle. Now, when we do this, we want to make sure that the knuckle lines up with both of the ball joint studs at the same time. Go ahead and slide it right up into position, and then we can start on our nuts. Let's start that lower ball joint nut on there. That's going to hold it in place. Now we can go ahead and put on our upper bracket here. Pay attention to the orientation of this. I have it so the little flippy-do is facing down, and that's going to be towards the front of the knuckle. We'll go ahead and put that right over the stud here, and we can put on our mounting nut. Now we can snug our lower ball joint nut. Once you have both of them snugged, continue on by torquing each of the nuts to 70 foot-pounds. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is pay attention to the ball joint nut in comparison to the ball joint stud. If you were to look at the ball joint stud, you're going to find that it has a hole making its way through it. You need to make sure that the slot of the castle nut lines up with it. If it doesn't, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. After that, put in your locking cotter pin. Now before we go ahead and put our axle in there, you want to of course find both of your shims. Clean them down and give them a quick inspection. Make sure they don't look dry rotted, cracked, or broken in any way. Assuming they look fine, go ahead and put them directly on the axle shaft. Then we'll slide the axle into the differential tube. Now when you press your axle in, you need to pay special attention to this area, right where the axle is supposed to meet up near the differential tube. You can see there's a plastic dust boot on there. That should be pretty much lined up with the differential tube. If it seems like it's hanging out of there, more than likely the axle isn't correctly in position. Let's continue on with some copper never sees. We're going to coat the entire area along where we cleaned up, the inner aspect right here and along the outer aspect. You don't necessarily need to get inside the bolt holes because the bolts will have red thread locker on them. Also, continue on with that copper never sees just along the axle splines. Once you've cleaned and thread locked the threading of the mounting bolts, continue on putting on your bearing. Make sure you have the backing plate in the proper position as well. Let's go ahead and slide this right over the splines of the axle. We'll try to line up all 3 of our bolt holes, the knuckle, backing plate, and the wheel bearing. After that, start in all 3 of your mounting bolts and snug them up. Once you have all of them snugged, torque each of them to 75 foot-pounds. The next thing we're going to do is get ready to start mounting our brakes on here. But before we do that, you want to make sure you clean down the mating surface of the bearing. If you were to look closely at this, you can see that it has a ridge up along the outer aspect. It dips in a little bit right here, and then it has another ridge that comes up a little bit closer towards the center. The main areas that you need to pay attention to this are on the raised ridges. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about this inner aspect when you're cleaning it down. Once you have that cleaned, go ahead and do the same thing to the back side of the rotor, the area that presses directly up against that wheel bearing. Make sure there's no rust or debris on that as well. Once you've done all that, continue on to applying some copper never-sees to the wheel bearing hub mating surface. We'll put that rotor right on there, and at this point I always just start on a lug nut to hold the rotor in place. Now it's going to be time to get ready to install our caliper. Before you do, inspect the threads on your mounting bolts, then apply some red thread locker. After that, go ahead and take that caliper and slide it right on over your rotor. Let's go ahead and put both of those mounting bolts in. Once you have both of them started, you can bottom them out. After that, torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Now it's time for the ABS wire. Let's take this ABS wire and you're going to bring it right underneath the knuckle, but above the axle. It needs to fit into this bracket right here. Let's go ahead and slide it right on through. You're going to be looking for this area right here. You can see where my index finger is. There's a little notch. Now that needs to actually fit into the slot that's inside of this bracket. Let's take this, we'll line it up and push it into position. You want to make sure it's extremely snug and it cannot fall out. We'll give that a nice wiggle. All right. Now let's continue up the line here. We're going to make our way to this bracket. Go ahead and slide it right on there the same way. Now we're just going to bring the rest of the ABS wire right along the flex hose here. You remember as we removed everything, we went ahead and pulled it right out of these grooves. Once again, you want to make sure that it's secure. If it feels as though one of these is broken or it's weak in any way, just use a wire tie to hold it in place. Now just bring this up and connect it in. Press that in, listen for a click, give it a tug. After that, lock it in with a red locking tab. Double check it to make sure it's completely secure, and then reattach this area to the back side of the shock mount. Let's make our way down here to our final mounting bracket. The next thing you want to do is double check all of your handiwork. You want to make sure that there's no way that this ABS wire can fall down and potentially get damaged in any way. Now let's get our steering stop bolt in here. Make sure your jam nuts bottomed out against the knuckle. Now we can start reattaching our tie rod ends. Once you have both of these bottomed out, you can torque each of them to 73 foot-pounds. Let's get some red thread locker on the axle shaft threads. Start a nut on there. Now we're just going to go ahead and bottom this out by hand. You never want to use an air gun because you don't want to damage your bearing in any way. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and torque this. What you're going to notice as you try to tighten this is more than likely going to want to spin on you. If that's the case, you can either have somebody step on the brake, or you can just use a long pry bar carefully across the studs so you don't damage any of the threads all the way down to the ground. That'll hold it in position. And now we can torque the axle nut to 100 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, let's just go ahead and take off this lug nut. After that, we can go ahead and grab the wheel and put it back in place. Okay, at this point, we can go ahead and put our wheel back up on here. After that, go ahead and start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. And then when we get the wheel back on the ground, we'll go ahead and torque each of them to 122 foot-pounds. All right, with the wheel back on the ground, let's go ahead and torque these. Torqued. Okay friends, we got our front end back together. What's left to do now? Now of course you're going to want to safely take it for a road test, listen for any funny noises, and of course get yourself down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.